Morning everybody, it's Tuesday morning and welcome to Penn Vicarage. Lovely to see you, hope you've had a lovely weekend and bank holiday and great to see you for our Bible reflection this morning. And friends, we are in Isaiah and chapter 8, so here goes. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it in common characters belonging to Maher-shalal-hash-baz and have it attested by me by reliable witnesses, the priests Uriah and Zechariah, son of Zeberechiah. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, name him Maher-shalal-hash-baz, for before the child knows how to call my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away by the king of Assyria. The Lord spoke to me again, because his people have refused the waters of Shiloh that flow gently and melt in fear before Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore the Lord is bringing up against it the mighty flood waters of the river, the king of Assyria and all its glory. And it will rise above all its channels and overflow all its banks. And it will sweep unto Judah as a flood, and pouring over it will reach up to the neck, and its outward wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Band together, you peoples, and be dismayed. Listen, all you far countries. Gird yourselves and be dismayed. Gird yourselves and be dismayed. Take counsel together, but it shall be brought to naught. Speak a word, but it shall not stand, for God is with us. For the Lord spoke thus to me while his hand was strong upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy, or that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what it fears, or be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, in him you shall regard as holy. Him you shall regard as holy. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. He will become a sanctuary, a stone one strikes against for both houses of Israel. He will become a rock one stumbles over, a trap and a snare for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them will stumble. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken. Bind up the testimony. Seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. See, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. Now if people say to you, consult the ghosts and the familiar spirits that chirp and mutter, should not the people consult their gods, the dead, on behalf of the living, for teaching and for instruction? Surely those who speak like this will have no dawn. They will pass through the land, greatly distressed and hungry. When they are hungry, they will be enraged and will curse the king and their gods. They will turn their faces upward, and they will look upon the earth, and will see only darkness and distress, the gloom of darkness, and they'll be thrust into thick darkness. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Friends, I have a confession. In all the, I think it's 4 years I've been doing these talks, this chapter I have agonised over more than any. That's why I didn't do the talk yesterday, because I was still agonised with it. It's difficult. The commentators don't agree. The Hebrew, I gather, is ambiguous. But anyway, having agonised long and hard about it, this is how I think it works. Right, let me remind you of the context. The situation is Jerusalem and Judea, the country around it. And up north, there's this big, in those days, really called a superpower called Assyria, otherwise known nowadays as Iraq. And for 50 years, Assyria had been relatively benign. But they've got a new king, and Assyria, as at this time, the time of this reading, becomes more powerful and more threatening. Now, between Judah and Assyria, you have two smaller countries between them. You have Israel, otherwise known as Samaria, and Israel and Judah, remember, the one time had been together. There's Israel, otherwise known as Samaria, and you have Syria, otherwise known as Aram. Anyway, seeing the growing Assyrian threat, Aram and Syria and Samaria, Israel, they form an alliance. And what they do is they decide they're going to attack Judah, on the principle that if they attack Judah, three countries are bigger than two, to try and counter the threat from the Assyrians. So these two countries, Syria and Samaria, smaller countries, decide they're going to attack Judah. And the context is King Ahaz of Judah, who is a poor and a weak king, is terrified out of his wits. What should he do? Should he form an alliance with Samaria and Israel and Syria, or should he form an alliance with the big boys at the top, Assyria? Or is there another way? At which point, enter the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah says to Ahaz, you shouldn't do either of the above. You should trust in God, because what God is going to do soon, God is going to make Assyria attack Syria and Samaria, and they're going to be wrecked. And besides, you haven't got to fear this alliance, because they're going to be wrecked, and you haven't got to fear Assyria either, because actually in God's eyes, he describes it as being like insects and like bees, that ultimately you should trust in God because God's so much more powerful. So Isaiah says, don't form any alliances with the alliance, don't form an alliance with Assyria, trust in God instead. And that's what happens. So what does Ahaz do? Well, in the end, Ahaz doesn't trust in God, and his fear of the Syrians and Samaritans gets the better of him, and he forms an alliance with the big boys at the top. He forms an alliance with Assyria. And as that is the context of this morning's reading. So, what does Isaiah say? Firstly, notice the complete and utter faith that Isaiah has. So much so in verses 1 to 4, what he does is, he says, I'm absolutely certain that God is going to make Assyria attack Syria and Israel. So what he does is he calls, and he knows they're going to be plundered. So he says, right, he meets up with the lady, and they have a child, and he calls the child Maher-shalal-hash-baz, which basically means carnage is coming and plunder's coming soon. That's what it means. And to prove he'd written it in advance, he makes this statement, and he gets 2 reliable witnesses to do it as well. So he calls his son, he calls by this interesting name. Imagine going to your first day at school. Well, what's your name, young man? Maher-shalal-hash-baz. There we go. Anyway, just to prove he said it was going to happen, he calls his son plunder, which is going to be taken away, and he also writes this thing down, so that when the time comes, Isaiah can turn around and say, when it happens, I told you so. That's what happens in verses 1 to 4. But notice the total faith of Isaiah. In the face of all this, everyone else saying differently, he's prepared to call his son after this, write this statement down to prove he's absolutely convinced that what was going to happen. Then, in verses 5 to 8, notice the opposite. Ahaz and the people do the opposite, and say that they trust instead of trusting in God, they form this alliance with Assyria, the very big boys in the north. As a result of which, he says, because you are frightened of this, what's going to happen is Assyria is going to come, and it is going to attack Syria and Israel. That's going to happen. But because of that, the Assyrians are actually going to come into Judah as well. And he uses the analogy of, you could have had the beautiful waters of Shiloh, the lovely, peaceful waters that you could have had by trusting in God. But instead you trusted the big waters instead. And in Assyria, as it happens, there are 2 very large rivers called the Tigris and the Euphrates. And he says, a bit like the large ones, Assyria will come. But because you've trusted in them, they're going to come into your country as well. So notice the first is the complete faith that Isaiah has in God, to the extent of naming his son and making his public statement. Contrast that with the lack of faith which Ahaz shows. His fear gets the better of him. He forms this dodgy alliance with Assyria, and because of that, not only does Assyria do what Isaiah said and take over Syria and Israel, they also come into Judah as well. So contrast the incredible faith in God that Isaiah has, that despite what's going on, he's fearless, whereas the lack of faith that Ahaz has, his fear gets the better of him. He doesn't trust in God, and instead he formed this dodgy alliance, and it'll come back to bite him in the end. Then in verses 9 and 10, you have again Isaiah's complete confidence of what's going to happen is what God says is going to happen. And he basically says, band together, you peoples, listen, gird yourselves and be dismayed. He's basically saying, it's going to happen, Assyria's going to do it. Essentially, it's like, I don't fear the future, come on, make my day. Essentially, is a bit what he's kind of saying there. Then, from there on in, you have, from verses 11 to the end, you have then the point that trusting in God, God is the big thing. And people have to either trust God or don't trust God. And what he talks a bit like God being a bit like a stumbling block. For those who trust in God, God becomes what he calls a sanctuary. For those who don't trust in God, it's obviously difficult. And there becomes a complete contrast in the country between those that trust in God and those that don't. And Isaiah's people, I think we refer to Emmanuel, they're the people who do trust in God. and they are fearless, whereas everybody else acts out of fear, and as a result, dread fills them. And in particular, two things that he says that you have to make sure you don't do. Firstly, and this is interesting, between verses 11 and 15, he talks about conspiracy, and he talks about dread and fear. And he says, do not call conspiracy what all the people call conspiracy. In other words, Isaiah saying to the godly people, don't believe everything that you hear. Trust in God. You'll hear conspiracy theories around, but don't believe them. Trust in God instead, because wherever things are, God is bigger than. And by goodness, isn't that accurate for us today? You know, with the internet and so on, we hear so many conspiracy theories, so many doom and gloom merchants, blah, 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 blah. We hear so much of it. Actually, what he's saying here is do not trust these conspiracy theories. Instead, put your trust in God. That's the other thing. And the other thing in verses 16 to the end, to the oncoming darkness and so on, and he's basically saying people look to all sorts of other things for guidance. They look to ghosts and necromancers and again, people look to all sorts of strange things for guidance. But when we have a God who loves us, a God who knows all, a God who is more powerful than all, a God who is with us, as there's what Emmanuel, God is with us. And he talks about people that trust in all these, people consult the ghost, the familiar spirit, that chirp and mutter. They consult their gods, the dead, on behalf of the living, for teaching and instruction. You know, so there's a degree of astonishment in here. Why would people want to trust these stupid things when you can trust in God instead? So that's what I think this chapter is essentially about. So in the first 4 verses, you have Isaiah's incredible faith in God. Even when everybody else seems to be saying completely opposite, Isaiah still absolutely knows what God's going to do, to the point of naming his son after it. Then in verses 5 to 8, you have the complete lack of faith that Ahaz. He's terrified. He forms this alliance with Assyria, and as a result, not only does Assyria take on Syria and Israel, they also come into their country as well. So that's the price of the fear there. Then in verses 9 and 10, Isaiah is so confident that he essentially says to these countries, come on, make my day. Then in verses 11 to 15, he says, do not be afraid. Trust in God instead. Don't listen to all the conspiracy theories. I think there's a big message to us today that we should listen to God instead, because there are so many theories and we should listen to God. And also in verses 16 to the end, that people trust in all sorts of strange things that that chirp and mutter, necromancers, the dead on the earth, and all sorts of bizarre things that people turn to. But instead, we should trust in God and in Him. He is our sanctuary. Friends, that is my trot at a very, very difficult chapter. I hope that makes sense to you. Read it again at your leisure. Hope you enjoy that, and